Hello, everybody. A warm welcome to another new series here on the Wine with Jimmy channel. Delighted that you have stopped by and welcome to this wonderful series of wine. So this is an educational channel which is designed to help those of you around the world that are studying your world of wine and to get the most from it, the most understanding to, of course, go into your examinations with bags of confidence to pass your examinations. And welcome to Italy. So a rather complex country, and we have a lot to talk about here indeed. So we are talking in this series about the introduction to Italy. And the introduction to Italy will really go through subjects such as ancient history to more modern history, general climatic and vineyard management types, key grape varieties, but not in huge detail, just an overview, general winemaking concepts, wine law regulations, and wine business. But please remember, this series is an introduction. We're going to get into much more detail as we go through the world of wine in the wonderful nation of Italy. Part 1, this part, and part 2 is available as free content, but parts 3 through to 7 will only be available on my e-learning portal. That's over, as it says at the bottom of the slide, at www.winewithjimmy.com. Please go and visit there to see all the added extras and benefits you can get to help you with your studies, including things like flashcards, revision sessions, questions, and of course, exclusive video content. If you do have any comments or questions during this video, it would be delightful to hear from you. So please do pop it in the comments section below this vid. Make sure you click like and subscribe whilst you are there. You can also get in touch by social media that you see at the bottom of every slide. So let's rock and roll looking at the world of Italy in terms of history. Wonderful concept to get stuck into. Now, many of you will be under the assumptions that, countries like France and Italy were really at the forefront of where wine comes from, specifically when we think about the Romans, for example. It isn't true, because wine we know in terms of commercial wine through Vitis vinifera stems from Mesopotamia, and it comes from regions and countries today that we know like Georgia, Armenia, and Turkey, and then moved its way westwards across Europe. So Italy, that we know of as Italy today, was a country that took to the vine quite early on. Of course, it had its indigenous vines as well, and started to cultivate wine commercially. I always say that Italy probably could have the phrase attached to it for wine in terms of being the oldest commercial wine producing country, whereas all countries before it, Greece, Eastern European areas, and certainly things like modern day Lebanon today, Phoenicia, but also places like Georgia, Armenia, were much smaller in their productions compared to what Italy would become under the Roman Empire. So it's important to think about Italy in that sense, that it is an important country for really being the first commercial production. And it has such an amazing, rich history, which gives it huge diversity as well. First thing we're going to mention is before any real structured civilization occurred in the Italian peninsula, we have a number of indigenous populations, a lot of tribes, and there are a number of them listed up here on your map. The Rieti, the Veneti, for example, Salassi, Liguri, Umbri, Piceni, the Samnites. And you'll notice some of these names, the etymology is important because it has given us potentially the administrative name of a certain area. So you'll see Umbri, of course, Umbria will derive from that. Veneti for Veneto. Things like Liguri for Liguria today, which is on that northwesterly sea part of the Mediterranean. So a lot of these tribes would produce wine in some way, from local vines, but nothing to a commercial nature that we know of at this point. The Rieti were quite important because we do say that they have quite a rich history in terms of cultivating the vine around Lake Garda and into the mountains, for example. Then we have major civilizations affecting the Italian peninsula and the major island affixed to it, which is Sicily, one of two very large islands affixed to it. We have the Phoenicians, and on this map I have coloured the Phoenicians in purple. Phoenicia actually takes its name from their most famous export, which is the purple dye. So I've done it in purple for a reason. And the Phoenicians started to arrive in southern Italy, specifically Sicily, around 1100 BC. They landed on the west part of Sicily, founding cities like Palermo, for example, meeting local tribespeople like the Elmians, who they actually traded quite well with. And then also the Sicani, which are up there as the kind of yellowy green. So the Sicanians, I suppose you would say. These are the oldest inhabitants of Sicily with a recorded name. And they believe that they originate from the Iberian Peninsula, but we're not 100% sure of that. But the Phoenicians arriving. Why is this important? Well, the Phoenicians, remember, come from today, modern day Lebanon. So they are really on the far eastern side of the Mediterranean, therefore closer to those origins of winemaking. Turkey, Armenia, Georgia, those areas. So therefore, they have much more of a connection for winemaking. And in fact, were very much famous for wine production and transport of wine. They had big maritime possibilities with the Phoenicians. We know this by a number of shipwrecks that have been found that date back to their times with amphora. So we know that they would have had winemaking and wine production skills, and they would have brought this with them to the Italian peninsula. Remember, at this point, it was full of tribes, so nothing as far civilized. We also then have, just a little bit later than when the Phoenicians first arrived, but in central Italy, so this is what today we call Tuscany, we have the expansion of the Etruscans. And look at that etymology as well. You can see where Tuscany comes from in the word Etruscan. So that's very important in terms of its link there. The Etruscan civilization developed before the 8th century BC, around the area today we know of as Tuscany, but also Umbria, and also a part of Latium, or Lazio, as we call it today. They reached their peak in the 6th century BC. They expanded into northern parts up to the Po River basin, so places like Piemonte, Veneto, Emilia-Romagna, Lombardia. They also expanded south into Lazio and also down into Campania as well. Wine was significantly a part of their society and their culture, and it was also thought to be exported by the Etruscans to local areas. Wines were exported to France and Spain as early as the 7th century BC, and once again we have amphora archaeological evidence to back this up. The Etruscans taught how to grow vines and to make and preserve wine to the northern tribes of things like Piemonte, the Salassi, the Liguri, for example, up in Lombardia, those kind of areas, the Veneti as well. The position in Italy in the center of the Mediterranean was beneficial for wine exports for the Etruscans and also the Greeks, who we will mention very shortly. Now, we have some influences here by the Etruscans. We've already just mentioned that they shared their viticultural knowledge to the north. They also domesticated vines and trained them high above the ground using trees as natural supports. So this is a very, very ancient method of vine training in place, set up by the Etruscans. Then we have the Greek cities. So the expansion of the various Greek cities. Remember, ancient Greece, as it's often called, wasn't really one single entity. It was a collection of city-states, Athens and Sparta, Thebes, etc. All of these different names. And the Greek faction started to expand to the west in the 8th to 6th century BC to places like Sicily, very importantly landing in eastern Sicily and establishing places like Syracuse and Catania, but also places like Campania, Calabria, Basilicata, Puglia, and even parts of Sardinia, all the yellowy shade on the map that you see here of Italy. So you'll see parts of Sardinia here as well. The Greeks were more advanced than the local populations and therefore, of course, strongly influenced them. And even remember, the Romans who set up their city and then formed their republic, which eventually turned into an empire, were hugely influenced by the Greeks. In fact, many important aristocratical person in Rome would go off to Greece to study, classically in places like Athens or Rhodes, to learn things like law, for example. Big influences from the Greek side of things. When the Greeks did arrive in southern Italy, they found the vines already widely present. It wasn't that they brought them across. They, of course, would have brought something across, but in fact, there were plenty of vines located down here already. And they, in fact, called these territories around places like Calabria, for example, Onotria, which is here, as you see, just at the bottom of the red box, which means the land of vines. And of course, where we take our terminology for winemaking, enology comes from this as well. That's the study of wine and winemaking. So we think it's to do with the fact that lots of vines were here. They called it the wine land. That's the main reason behind it. So as the Etruscans carried out in central Italy, the Greeks became exceptionally creative, instrumental in the development and improvement of viticulture and winemaking in this landscape. They, as I mentioned, found lots of vines, but they brought lots of vines with them as well. They introduced head training systems, or bush training, as we know, and they influenced, once again, the ways of producing wine and storing it and preserving it. Then we have, of course, the Roman influence. The city of Rome was founded by, as the fables go, Romulus and Remus. And the Roman kingdom, so the city, eventually changed to the Roman Republic in the 6th century BC. Of course, Republic being very important, one of the most important changes in social structure across the world at that time, where most areas were ruled by monarchies. You have a republic here and a senate. And of course, there are even lots of instances where plebs could veto certain moves done by consuls, etc., due to the fact that we have a Senate in place here and a House of Representatives and so on. But Rome did become a very strong military power, as we know. The Roman Republic became an empire in 27 AD. That's when Octavian becomes Augustus after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra. By 117 AD, so just 90 years after that, the Roman Empire had expanded so much that it controlled all of this area we see in red, and it was the biggest known to the known world at that time. They adopted and improved viticulture from the Etruscans, who they had conquered, and also the Greeks, who they had conquered. And of course, that's very important in terms of stabilizing this area to produce very important wine. So it's important to ask this question: what have the Romans ever done for us? It's a classic line from Monty Python and The Life of Brian. And of course, everyone's really angry. What have they ever done for us? And well, sanitation, hospitals. And in that list, in that comedy sketch, they list, of course, wine, because it is culturally mightily important to the Mediterranean diet. Some more ancient history here for you. So several authors wrote about viticultural practices, winemaking, grape growing, and certain wines and the fame of certain wines during these times. Much of this understanding and knowledge became the base of grape growing and winemaking adopted in Europe following the centuries through the Middle Ages and even up towards the modern age. We have famous works being mentioned by Pliny the Elder. So we have, of course, on the right-hand side, so actually this is all Columella, but Pliny the Elder mentioned many grapes and lots of wines of his time. In fact, I've got a good map showing quite a number of certain wines which are mentioned by Pliny the Elder coming up very shortly. And then Columella, who is on the picture here, produced a work called De Re Rustica. And this is actually not in 1564. That's a long time after. But this is, I think, a recreation of the book that you'll see here. And in this book, which means kind of where country matters, there were suggestions on what grapes to grow on what soil and what areas were the best. So you could say that this book, which was first produced during Roman times, is the first instances of matching terroir with wine production, which is quite important. Here are some of those famous styles. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there are some very famous wine styles across it. We're, of course, really just focusing here on the Italian peninsula and not the whole Roman Empire. So there are some famous names in the Italian peninsula, like Cetinum, for example, which was known as being a strong, sweet Italian wine around Lazio, today, back then called Latium. And it was a very favored wine of Augustus that I mentioned, Octavian previously known as, and from the hills of Setia. But it apparently then sort of fell out of favor when Nero came into production. But there we go. I say came into production, came into power, should be it. We have the Rhaetic wines of the north of Italy, sweet wine again, prized highly in the empire from around Verona. And Suetonius, who was a fairly important author, actually claims that this was the famous wine that Augustus liked, not Cetinum, but who knows. Falernum I'll talk about in a second, but we have Sorrentine as well, which is from around Naples and also the likes of Sicily, very famous wines. Remember, Sicily had Phoenician and Greek influences before, of course, Roman. So lots of famous wines here, Mamertinum, Mergentinum, Biblinos, and a lot of these wines famed by people like Caesar, for example, Julius Caesar, arguably the first dictator of the Roman Empire. So yeah, famous wine styles, there you are. I'm going to go towards Falernum now, which is possibly the most famous style from this time. We're focusing on an area called Pompeii, very close to Mount Vesuvius in Campania. Today, Pompeii is only a city of around 25,000 and more commonly visited for its ruins, which were covered in ash from the 79 AD eruption of Mount Vesuvius. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but lots of horrible things happened there. Many people died, which is not a great thing. But one thing it's good for the future is that it preserved pretty much the city as it was in that moment. And in fact, they unearthed with the archaeological digs around 200 wine taverns or bars where there were markings on the walls about different price points of different wines, these big troughs where the barkeep would scoop up the wine and pour it into a container. This is where we get a lot of our information from around winemaking. And it leads me to the most famous style, which is Falernum. Wonderful story behind this. So basically, as it goes, there is a mountain to the north of this area, in the north coastal part of Campania, which is called the Monte Massico. So apparently, as it goes, there is a farmer on the slopes of the mountain called Falerno, and he was a very modest farmer, and he was visited by a god who was actually in disguise as a peasant. The god was Bacchus, the god of wine. This farmer, Falerno, took pity upon this peasant who was in need of help and gave him water and gave him food. And Bacchus was so moved by this farmer's wonderful care and attention and its good Samaritan nature that he turned his water into wine and turned the landscape that was quite barren on the slopes of Monte Massico into flourishing vineyards. And this is said to be the real starting point of Falernum, the famous wine from this area, named after this farmer Falerno. And it's important to mention this because it really does give you a sense of a hierarchy of quality from this area, this time, back 2,000 years ago. Because of the Pompeii preserved ruins, we actually started to see different levels of this one wine. You can get Falernum, you can get Falernum Calcinum, and then Falernum Faustinium. And these three levels really were said to be standard Premier Cru and Grand Cru, which is something which we're very much firmly structured on across Western Europe today. Certainly in places like France and even places like Italy as well. So it's quite fascinating that we have this history going that far back, and that's where we, of course, stem from. And then just going to the last slide here, talking about the fall of the Roman Empire. In 476, the Roman Empire collapses on the west. It splits firmly between the West and the East. The Eastern Roman Empire, which then later becomes known as the Byzantine or Byzantine Empire, continues with Constantinople as its real sort of seat of power. But the Western Roman Empire firmly collapses. Rome gets sacked many times by Gallic tribes, lots of different tribes, and then enters things like the Ostrogoths, the Lombards, the Franks, the emergence of the Papal States, the Normans, the Arabs. There are a number of different factions that then start to vie for the attentions of the Italian peninsula. And they say this enters the Dark Ages because we have a collapse of civilization, then into sort of barbarian, tribal forces at play. But many of these tribes by this time were very much linked to the Roman civilization, and a lot of them were exceptionally civilized, like the Visigoths, for example. So it's a big debate to be had whether we should call it the Dark Ages or not, but it's another story for another day. Importantly for us, and this is where we'll end this presentation, the civilization which was beforehand the Romans was long, good sort of 600-700 years. So a lot of stability, lots of good wine production flourished. But then there was lots of instability that followed, and wine suffered as a result of that. And it only started to pick up when, of course, the power of the church started to increase, really as the Dark Ages changed to the Middle Ages. And that's what we'll pick up on the next video. So thank you so much for your time and attention looking at the ancient history of Italy. I do hope you've enjoyed it. I have given you a huge more amount of information that's in your syllabus, but that's, of course, what we do here at Wine with Jimmy, to give you as much knowledge and information as possible. As always, if you have any comments, questions or concerns, please do pop that in the comments section below this video. Make sure you click like and subscribe as always. Social media you'll find at the bottom of every slide too. Join me for part 2. That's another free video available here. Yes, I'll see you for that. And if you find yourself in London as well, here in the United Kingdom, please come and see me for a class, a glass or a bottle. I've been Jimmy Smith. Ciao for now. Thank you.